Good morning, everyone. Happy Monday morning to you, and welcome back to Morning Musings. My name is Don K. Preston. I am the president of Preterist Research Institute of Ardmore, Oklahoma, and we're looking at the language of Matthew 24:29 to 31, where Jesus, in his prediction of the fall of Jerusalem, the end of the age, and his coming, which the disciples all believed were connected. And look, folks, the disciples weren't nearly as confused as modern-day commentators want to claim. And by the way, I'm in the process of writing a series of articles on Matthew chapter 24, 1 to 3. They're on my website, donkpreston.com, so you can go there and read so far it's 3 articles, maybe 4. Anyway, I'll be posting another one this week on which disciples were or are confused. Because, here's the deal. When Jesus predicted the fall of Jerusalem and the destruction of the temple, the disciples immediately asked us, tell us, when shall these things be? What shall be the sign of your coming and the end of the age? Virtually everyone admits the disciples were linking Jesus' prediction of the fall of the temple, destruction of the temple, with his coming and the end of the age. And yet they turn around and tell us the disciples were confused. They had no idea that those were 2 totally separate and distinct events. Now, you've got people like Sam Frost who are so incredibly confused, they can't make up their mind. Back in March of last year, I asked Sam, what age did the disciples link with the fall of Jerusalem when Jesus predicted the fall of Jerusalem and destruction of the temple? And he said they didn't connect the end of any age with the destruction of Jerusalem. Well, it wasn't, but a couple of months later, he said it was perfectly natural for the disciples to conflate, his word, the end of the age and Christ coming with the destruction of the temple. So he goes from telling us, no, they didn't make any connection between the end of any age and the destruction of the temple to telling us, it was perfectly natural for them to do so, and they did so. That kind of confusion is just rampant with Mr. Frost. But, again, the majority of commentators say the disciples were in fact confused. What I've been sharing with you over the last several weeks is that this language of the destruction of the sun, the moon, the stars, the decreation language, would have fit extremely well. It was, as a matter of fact, the key element in the databank of the early apostles who were faithful Jews, understood the Old Testament language, and they knew that any time that God judged a kingdom, a city, a nation, they knew that God described it in the terms of the destruction of heaven and earth. They knew, please catch the power of this, those apostles knew that Jerusalem and the temple were destroyed in BC 586, right? After all, they had 3 feast days, according to Zechariah. They had 3 feast days commemorating the events surrounding the fall of Jerusalem in BC 586. Okay, those disciples knew that destruction of 586 was called the Day of the Lord, book of Zephaniah. They knew that in the book of Jeremiah chapter 4, 25 and following, it was described as the destruction of creation. They knew it was called the day of the Lord's vengeance. On and on. This is the data bank possessed by the apostles, knowing full well that when God predicted the fall of a city, a kingdom, a nation, he used the language of the sun being turned to darkness, the moon being turned to blood, the stars of the heaven being shaken. That was typical Hebraic thought. And so when modern commentators say, oh, well, Jesus predicted the fall of Jerusalem, and the disciples had absolutely no clue that that would ever happen. Well, they knew it happened in 586 BC, didn't they? They knew about Daniel 9 that predicted the destruction of Jerusalem at the end of the 70 weeks, and there was a widespread belief in Jesus' generation that they were living in the time of the fulfillment of Daniel 9. Are we supposed to believe that that Jesus' apostles were just, they only had an IQ one point above a box of rocks? I mean, that's what we're being asked to believe. That they had to overlook and to ignore their entire knowledge of the Old Testament. They're supposed to completely ignore and deny the metaphoric, hyperbolic nature of the language of destruction of a kingdom and a city. And all of a sudden, when Jesus predicted the destruction of Jerusalem for his generation, all of a sudden, the disciples said, oh my goodness, he must be talking about the end of material creation. He must be talking about his coming out of heaven on a literal cumulus cloud. Even though Yahweh came on the clouds, flaming fire, with a voice, a shout, etc., in the fall of Jerusalem in BC 586. Now, this time, even though the apostles knew about that previous event, knew it was not literally fulfilled, now this time, when Jesus predicted it, they're supposed to be thinking about the end of time and Jesus coming out of heaven in a physical body. I'm telling you what, folks, the argument that the disciples were confused and ignorant when Jesus used the language of Matthew 24, 29 and following, stretches credulity to the point of breaking. And once again, it absolutely demands. Number one, the apostles were totally ignorant of how Jerusalem had been destroyed. Number two, they were totally ignorant of the prophetic language that was used to describe that event in 586 BC. Number three, they were totally ignorant of the fact that when God destroyed Jerusalem and the temple in 586 BC, he called it the day of the Lord, the day of the Lord's vengeance, the day of the Lord's coming, the destruction of heaven and earth. See, they supposedly had forgotten all that or didn't know it when Jesus made his prediction in Matthew 24 and verse 2. And so, as I'm suggesting in that series of articles on my website, please go read them. We're being asked to believe that Jesus' apostles were incredibly ignorant. Unbelievably ignorant. They had no clue that the Jerusalem temple was supposed to be destroyed again, even though the Old Testament foretold it in many places, and they had completely forgotten the metaphoric, hyperbolic nature of the language that was used to predict the fall of Jerusalem in 586 BC. That's what we're being asked to believe when people come to Matthew 24, verse 3, and they look at the disciples' questions, and they come to Matthew 24, 29 to 31, and the language of the sun being dark and the moon being turned to blood, and they say, oh, that's got to be literal. That's got to be literal language. Upon what basis? It had never been literal before. Never. And yet we're supposed to believe that all of a sudden, it has to be taken literally. No. Makes no sense whatsoever. Okay, well, I just wanted to set that before us as a reminder, as a hermeneutical reminder of some of the issues that confront us when we come to Matthew chapter 24. Now, tomorrow's video, I'm going to go back to Isaiah chapter 34, and I am going to demonstrate for you how Isaiah 34 was fulfilled according to the divine scriptures that say that what Isaiah predicted had come to pass. Now, if the prediction of Isaiah 34 had come to pass, then since the language of Isaiah 34 was the entire cosmos being rolled up like a scroll, growing old and passing away, melting with blood, if we have a record of the biblical writer saying Isaiah 34 was fulfilled, no, not in those specific words, but if we have record of the biblical writer saying that prophecy was fulfilled, then guess what? We are forced, if we're going to be honest with the text, that is, we are forced to conclude it's metaphoric, hyperbolic language. So yeah, you don't want to miss tomorrow. In the meantime, don't forget, hey look, this month is getting away. This limited time offer is slipping away. 3 books, Have Heaven and Earth Passed Away, directly relevant to the examination of language we're studying. Like Father, Like Son on Clouds of Glory, an in-depth examination of the nature of the coming of Christ, and The Elements Shall Melt with Fervent Heat. Again, an in-depth examination of the language of the heaven and earth passing away. If you bought all 3 books separately, they would cost you over $60. But for the rest of January 2020, U.S. orders only. If you're out of the country and you want PDF copies at a greatly reduced price even, contact me. But for U.S. orders, total delivered price, $40. Save you over $20, folks. Can't beat a deal like that. Okay, I will see you on the flip side.